My mom left me alone in the hospital for surgery because of her honeymoon. I'm 21 now, but this story takes place when I was 16. Back then, I was just a kid trying to figure out where I fit in my mom's new life. Spoiler alert, I didn't. My mom, Lisa, and I had always been a team. It was just the two of us, and for most of my life, that was enough. We weren't rich, not even close. Mom worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to keep us afloat. But even on the worst days, she made sure I was fed, clothed, and had a roof over my head. I respected her for that. I love her for that. We had our little traditions. Friday nights were always movie nights, where we'd eat cheap takeout on the couch and laugh at bad dialogue. On my birthdays, no matter how broke we were, she'd bake a homemade cake, always slightly lopsided but filled with more love than any store-bought one could ever have. She wasn't perfect, but she was my mom, and she always made me feel like I mattered. Then she met Greg. Greg was a 45-year-old businessman, wealthy, confident, and charming in the kind of way that made people lean in when he spoke. He walked into our lives like he owned the room, and within months, he had my mom wrapped around his finger. At first, I didn't mind. He made her happy, and after years of watching her struggle, I wanted that for her. He took her to fancy restaurants, bought her jewelry, and even paid off some of our lingering bills. It was like we'd suddenly entered a different world, one where money wasn't an issue, and my mom didn't have to stress over every grocery run. But Greg wasn't just rich. He was calculated. He was polite, sure, but there was always something about him that felt off. The way he looked through me instead of at me. The way he never asked me questions, never tried to get to know me. Then a small exclusion started. Greg had a massive house. The first time we visited, my mom gushed over the marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows. I was just excited to have my own room for the first time. But when we moved in, something became painfully clear. This wasn't our home. It was Greg's, and I wasn't welcome in it. The first sign? The family dinners that weren't really family dinners at all. At our old place, we always ate together, even if it was just mac and cheese on the couch. At Greg's, things were different. Some nights, my mom and Greg would go out to eat at some fancy restaurant while I was left to fend for myself. Other times, they'd have a candlelit dinner in the dining room while I sat in the kitchen eating leftovers. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was being too sensitive. But then came Christmas. I remember that Christmas morning vividly. The tree was massive, covered in elegant ornaments and perfectly wrapped gifts underneath. My mom unwrapped a diamond bracelet. Greg got some high-end golf clubs. And me? A $50 Amazon gift card. Not that I expected diamonds or anything, but it was the carelessness of it. The way Greg didn't even look at me when he handed it over. The way my mom's smile faltered when she saw my expression, but she didn't say anything. I wasn't family. I was an obligation. I tried to tell my mom how I felt, but she always had an excuse. Greg is just not used to having kids around. You need to be more mature. You're almost an adult now. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that if I just tried harder, Greg would start seeing me as part of his life. So I stopped complaining. I tried to be invisible, figuring that if I didn't bother him, maybe things would get better. But they didn't. Then came the night that changed everything. Greg had planned a big dinner at some high-end restaurant. My mom had spent hours getting ready, curling her hair and wearing a dress that probably cost more than our old apartment's rent. She looked beautiful, happy. I want to be happy for her, too. When we got to the restaurant, I was ready to finally feel included. Maybe this was the night Greg would finally see me as part of the family. But as soon as we reached the host, Greg turned to me and said, "Hey, why don't you let your mom and me have some alone time tonight? Here." He handed me a crumpled $20 bill. "Go grab a burger or something. We'll be back in a couple of hours." And just like that, I was dismissed. I stood there, stunned, watching as my mom hesitated for half a second before giving me a small, apologetic smile. "We won't be long, sweetie. We'll do something together tomorrow, okay?" Tomorrow never came. That night, Greg proposed. My mom came home glowing, flashing the expensive ring on her finger, rambling about how perfect the night was, how happy she was, how lucky we were. She barely noticed the untouched fast food bag sitting on the counter. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just being ignored. I was being replaced. From that night on, I started counting the days. Not until the wedding. Not until we became a family. Until I could leave. Because I knew, deep down, that if Greg had his way, I wouldn't be part of my mom's new life at all. By the time my mom and Greg got married, I had already started pulling away. I stopped trying to be included, stopped expecting to be acknowledged. Greg didn't want me around, and my mom, whether she realized it or not, was following his lead. I kept my head down, stayed out of their way, and counted the days until I turned 18. I didn't expect much from them anymore, but I still thought, if something serious ever happened, my mom would be there for me. I was wrong. It started the night before their honeymoon. They were supposed to leave the next morning for Greece, some all-expenses-paid, 2-week-long getaway in a 5-star resort. Greg had been bragging about it for months, listing off luxury amenities and once-in-a-lifetime experiences like he was the only person in the world who had ever gone on vacation. My mom was excited, too. She spent the whole day packing, buzzing around the house, making sure everything was perfect for their trip. I tried to stay out of the way, but I wasn't feeling great. At first, it was just some discomfort, a dull pain in my lower stomach. I figured it was nothing, just something I ate. But as the night went on, it got worse. Much worse. By midnight, I was curled up in my bed, sweating through my shirt, my stomach in knots. Every tiny movement sent sharp pain shooting through my side. It wasn't normal. Something was really, really wrong. I forced myself out of bed and stumbled toward my mom's room, barely able to stand upright. By the time I made it to the hallway, the pain was so unbearable that my vision blurred. Then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, my body shaking. I could hear voices, muffled, urgent. Then footsteps. Then my mom's face hovering over me, eyes wide with panic. "Oh my God, sweetie, what happened?" I tried to respond, but my throat was dry and the pain was too much. I felt like my insides were twisting themselves into knots. Then I heard Greg's voice. Not panicked, not worried, annoyed. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. Of all nights, I barely had the strength to process it, but some part of me registered the absolute disgust in his tone. Like I had collapsed on purpose. Like I was inconveniencing him. Even through the pain, that hurt more than I expected. My mom helped me up, supporting most of my weight as she guided me toward the car. "We need to get him to the hospital," she said, her voice shaking. Greg sighed. Actually sighed. "Lisa, we have a flight in 6 hours," he reminded her, like that was the real emergency here. My mom shot him a glare. "I don't care about the flight right now. He needs a doctor." Greg didn't argue, but he didn't help either. The entire drive to the hospital, he was silent, gripping the steering wheel with irritation. My mom kept glancing back at me, biting her lip anxiously, but Greg? He just kept checking the time. By the time I got to the ER, I was barely conscious. The pain was unbearable, radiating through my entire body. My mom was in full panic mode, explaining everything to the doctors while Greg stood off to the side, scrolling through his phone. After a quick examination, the doctor didn't even hesitate. "He needs surgery immediately. Appendicitis. My appendix was inflamed and at risk of bursting. If we had waited much longer, it could have been life-threatening." They started prepping me for surgery right away. Everything was happening so fast. Nurses moving around, setting up IVs, doctors asking me questions I could barely process. I was scared, not just from the pain, not just because of the surgery, but because in the back of my mind, I was still expecting my mom to be there for me. I thought, this is the moment she chooses me. I was wrong. The doctor turned to my mom. "It's a routine procedure, but he'll need someone here when he wakes up." My mom hesitated, just for a second, but that second was enough. Greg cleared his throat, stepping forward. "How long does the whole thing take?" "A few hours, plus recovery time. You should be able to go home by tomorrow afternoon." Greg checked his watch. "So if we leave now, we'll still make our flight." I was lying there, barely able to move, barely able to breathe from the pain. And that's what he cared about? I turned my head toward my mom, waiting for her to shut him down. To say, "Are you insane? We're not leaving." To say, "This is my son. Of course I'm staying." But instead, she just stood there, conflicted, torn between me and the man who had given her everything. She looked at Greg, looked at me. Then she sighed, and I knew she had already made her choice. She knelt beside me and whispered, "Sweetie, you're going to be okay. The doctors are going to take great care of you." I swallowed hard, my throat burning. "You're not staying?" She looked away. "I wish I could, honey, but we already paid for the trip." My stomach twisted, and not just from the pain. I had never felt so small in my life. Greg put a hand on her shoulder. "He's not a little kid, Lisa. He'll be fine." My mom nodded. Then, as if that made it okay, she leaned down and pressed a kiss to my forehead. "I love you, sweetie. I'll call after your surgery." Then she left. I watched the doors swing shut behind them, my vision swimming, my chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with my failing appendix. It wasn't just abandonment. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the moment I realized I didn't have a mother anymore. Not really, because from that point on, she wasn't my mom. She was Greg's wife. I don't remember much of the surgery itself. Just flashes of cold, sterile light and muffled voices before everything went dark. Then, slowly I came back. Groggy. Heavy. My whole body felt like it had been weighed down with cement. My brain sluggish from the anesthesia. The pain wasn't as sharp as before, but a dull ache lingered in my stomach, a deep soreness that pulsed with every breath. I blinked, my vision adjusting to the dim glow of the hospital room. The air smelled like antiseptic, too clean, too artificial. Machines beeped softly beside me, monitoring my heart rate, my oxygen levels. And then it hit me. The room was quiet. Too quiet. I turned my head slightly, expecting to see my mom sitting in the chair beside my bed, maybe groggy from lack of sleep, maybe scrolling through her phone to pass the time. But the chair was empty. No comforting hand to hold. No reassuring smile. No warmth of a familiar presence to tell me I wasn't alone in this. Because I was alone. Completely. A note and a stranger. I swallowed hard, forcing my sluggish body to move. The smallest shift sent a wave of nausea rolling through me, and I had to squeeze my eyes shut for a second. When I opened them again, I noticed something on the bedside table. A note. A neatly folded piece of paper propped up against a bottle of water. I reached for it, my fingers shaky as I unfolded the page. My mom's handwriting stared back at me, looping letters that I had seen 1,000 times on grocery lists, birthday cards, and reminders stuck to the fridge. But this note wasn't like those. This note felt like a goodbye. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry I couldn't stay. You're strong, and I know you'll be okay. Greg, and I will check in every day. I love you. Mom." I read it once, twice, and on the third time, I felt something inside me snap. My hands clenched the paper, my fingers curling so tight that the edges crumpled. That was it. That was all I got. They had been gone for hours. Long enough for me to wake up, come out of anesthesia, and start processing what had happened. They hadn't even waited to make sure I was okay. They had just left. Like I was a problem they had tossed aside. Like I was an inconvenience they had dealt with and then moved on from. Greg never wanted me around. And my mom, whether she meant to or not, had chosen him over me a long time ago. A gentle knock at the door pulled me from the whirlwind of thoughts racing through my mind. I turned my head slightly as a nurse entered, her warm smile offering a small sense of reassurance. She greeted me softly, her voice laced with kindness as she adjusted something on the monitor beside me. There was a hint of relief in her tone as she mentioned how much of a scare I had given them. Swallowing against the tightness in my throat, I managed to ask how long I had been unconscious. Her answer came easily, 6 hours. She reassured me that the surgery had gone well and that, while I'd be sore for a few days, everything looked good. I nodded, absorbing the words, but not really focusing on the medical details. My mind was elsewhere, still trying to catch up with everything that had happened. 6 hours. 6 whole hours since my mom had left me here. I was still trying to process everything when the nurse's gaze flickered toward the door. Her voice was careful, almost reassuring, as she mentioned that my guardian had arranged for someone to check in on me, as if that was supposed to make me feel better. The word stuck in my mind. Guardian? I frowned, confusion settling in. She hesitated before explaining. My mom and stepfather had left for a trip, but they had made sure someone would be here for me. A sinking feeling started to form in my chest. I already knew I wasn't going to like whatever came next. Her tone remained light, almost too casual. She mentioned that it was an older woman, someone from the neighborhood. It took me a second, but then it clicked. Mrs. Palmer. She lived a few houses down from us. A sweet but distant lady in her 70s who always smelled like peppermint and mothballs. She wasn't exactly the sit-by-your-bedside-and-take-care-of-you type. More like the gives-out stale candy on Halloween and feed stray cats type. And this was who my mom had left me with? Not a family member, not a close friend, just a random old neighbor. Someone checking on me once a day, make sure I hadn't keeled over, and then go back to her life. I wasn't even being treated like a person. I was being treated like a fucking pet. Like Greg and my mom had made arrangement for someone to stop by, feed me, and make sure I was still breathing, but nothing more. I felt sick, not from the surgery, not from the anesthesia, but from the sheer, overwhelming realization of how little I mattered to them. The nurse must have sensed my mood shift because she softened her voice. Would you like me to call someone for you? A friend? A family member? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to say, please, yes, call someone who actually gives a shit about me, because I clearly don't have parents anymore. But the truth was, I didn't know who to call. I had been drifting further and further away from my mom for months. Greg had made sure I never truly felt welcome in his home. And in the process, I had lost any real support system I might have had. There was only one person I could think of. One person who had always been there, even when my mom had pushed her away. One person who had warned me about Greg from the very beginning, only to be ignored. My older sister, Emma. Emma had been out of my life for years. She was 8 years older than me, and we used to be close when I was little. She'd help me with my homework, take me out for ice cream, even sneak me into her room when I had nightmares so I wouldn't have to sleep alone. But when Greg came into the picture, everything changed. Emma saw through him from the start. She had tried to warn my mom, tried to point out all the red flags, the manipulation, the way he subtly pushed me out, the way he took over her life so quickly. My mom hadn't listened. Instead, she had called Emma jealous, told her she was being selfish, that she was just upset that my mom had finally found happiness. And when Emma refused to support the relationship, my mom cut her off, stopped calling, stopped visiting. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not because I didn't want to, but because I hadn't known if I could. But now, lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling with my mom's half-assed note crumpled in my fist, I made a decision. I wasn't going back to that house. I wasn't going to pretend this was normal. And I sure as hell wasn't going to keep letting myself be cast aside like I didn't matter. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone and found Emma's number. I had no idea if she would even answer, but I had nowhere else to turn. So I took a deep breath, swallowed my pride, and pressed call. The phone rang once, twice. Then, just as I was about to lose hope, a familiar voice, slightly wary, slightly shocked. I hesitated for a moment before answering. Emma. I barely recognized my own voice. It sounded hoarse, weak, like a child who had been crying for hours. In a way, that's exactly what I was. I was still groggy from the anesthesia, still aching from the surgery, but the weight in my chest was heavier than anything physical. A part of me expected her to hang up. It had been so long since we talked, since my mom had cut her off. What if she didn't want to hear from me? What if she thought I had abandoned her too? But Emma's voice softened. What's wrong? The realization hit hard as the words barely escaped my lips. Mom had left. I swallowed against the lump forming in my throat, trying to keep my voice steady. They had gone on their honeymoon. Today, on the day of my surgery, it just left. Then, Emma spoke, low and sharp, like she was struggling to contain her anger. Are you serious? She started to say something, but caught herself, inhaling sharply like she was forcing herself to stay calm. She didn't hesitate. I'm coming. The words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so long feeling unwanted, so long convincing myself that I was better off dealing with things alone, that I had almost forgotten what it was like to have someone choose me. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting. The hospital buzzed around me, nurses walking past my room, doctors murmuring in the hallway. But it all felt distant, like I was watching the world through a fog. The note from my mom was still crumpled in my hand. I couldn't bring myself to let it go. It wasn't that I wanted to hold on to it. It was that I couldn't believe it was real. Even after everything, some small, stupid part of me had clung to the idea that my mom loved me. That no matter how much she prioritized Greg, no matter how many vacations she took without me, no matter how many times she brushed me aside, if it really came down to it, she would choose me. She hadn't. And that truth settled in my stomach like a weight I would never be able to shake. A knock at the door snapped me out of my thoughts. A nurse poked her head in, smiling kindly. Your visitor is here. For a second, I almost thought she was talking about my mom. that some part of her had come to her senses, that she had realized what she had done and rushed back to the hospital to make things right. But when the door opened fully, it wasn't my mom standing there. It was Emma, and just seeing her, it nearly broke me. She looked different from how I remembered. Her hair was shorter, cut just above her shoulders. She was wearing jeans and a hoodie, her face bare of makeup, her expression tight, with barely restrained anger. But despite everything that had changed, she was still Emma, still my big sister, still the only person in my life who had ever truly fought for me. The moment she saw me, her expression softened. That's all it took. Emma crossed the room in 2 steps and wrapped her arms around me. And I broke. I didn't even realize I was crying until I felt the tears spill onto her shoulder. I had spent so long convincing myself I didn't need anyone, that I could handle things on my own. That it was better to be alone than to risk being unwanted. Now I was in a hospital bed, clinging to my sister like a lifeline, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. After a while, I managed to pull myself together. Emma pulled back slightly, keeping her hands on my shoulders as she scanned my face. "I can't believe she left you." She inhaled sharply. "I told her Greg was a piece of shit. I told her he would never treat you like family." I nodded. She didn't care. Emma wasted no time making it clear I wasn't going back. There was no hesitation in her voice, no room for argument. I had spent so long believing I had no other options, that no matter how unwanted I felt in that house, I had to stay, that I had to make it work, had to keep trying, had to accept whatever scraps of attention my mom had left for me. She saw what I was too afraid to admit. Staying would only mean more of the same. More neglect, more isolation, more of me pretending that one day my mom would wake up and realize she had abandoned her son. That wasn't going to happen. Emma had already made up her mind, and honestly, I think some part of me had, too. She told me she had a place of her own, a small apartment about an hour away, nothing fancy, but enough for the both of us. She had a job, stability, and, most importantly, the willingness to take me in without a second thought. She wasn't offering pity, and she wasn't doing it out of obligation. She was doing it because I was her brother, and that was enough for her. The plan was simple. She would sign me out of the hospital, help me pack whatever I wanted from the house, and I'd leave with her that night. No drawn-out fights, no dramatic confrontations. She wasn't interested in giving our mom the opportunity to justify what she had done. She wasn't interested in letting Greg even have a word in this. Neither was I. It hit me then how easy it was, how simple it had always been. I had spent so long feeling trapped, like I had no way out, but all it had taken was one phone call to Emma and a single decision. I was done waiting for my mom to care. I was done fighting for a place in a family that had no space for me. Emma helped me sign the hospital discharge papers, handled everything with the nurses, and made sure I had all the post-surgery care instructions before we left. She had always been like that, practical, efficient, the kind of person who got things done without wasting time. She had barely spoken on a drive home, but she didn't need to. Everything she was doing told me exactly what I needed to hear. You belong here. You are not a burden. You are safe. I should have slept that night. I wanted to. My body was exhausted, my stitches sore, the weight of everything pressing down on me like bricks. But my mind wouldn't shut off. I kept thinking about my mom. I kept thinking about whether she had even noticed I was gone. It took 2 weeks for them to come back. I had expected something sooner, a call, a text, anything. Some part of me had thought my mom would at least try to reach out while she was still in Greece, that she'd check in, make sure I was okay, even if it was just out of guilt. But there had been nothing. Radio silence. Emma hadn't been surprised. She had shrugged it off like it was exactly what she had expected. But I had seen the way she kept glancing at me in those first few days, waiting for me to break, waiting for the weight of it all to hit me. It did hit me, just not in the way I thought it would. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I just felt done. So when she finally called, 2 weeks after leaving me in a hospital bed, I didn't feel anything at all. Emma was the one who saw the name on my phone screen first. I was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through channels on TV, when she glanced over from the stove and stiffened. "Are you going to answer that?" she asked. I looked at the phone buzzing on the table. I let it ring. The next morning, my mom showed up at Emma's apartment. She didn't call ahead, didn't text to ask if I was even there. She just knocked, loud and impatient, like she was entitled to be let in. Emma answered the door. For a second, Neither of them spoke. My mom had never been great at hiding her emotions, and right now, she looked exhausted. Her hair was still perfectly styled, her nails still manicured, but there were dark circles under her eyes, her lips pressed into a tight, thin line. She looked angry. Emma didn't invite her in. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, waiting. My mom's eyes flickered past her, scanning the apartment, looking for me. She didn't have to wait long. I was already standing behind Emma, watching. The moment she saw me, her expression shifted. Her whole face softened, like she was relieved, like she had been worried about me, like she actually believed she had the right to be worried after what she had done. I didn't say anything. She took a breath, then started talking. Fussed. She said I had overreacted, that she hadn't abandoned me, that she had made sure someone was there for me, that she had trusted I would be fine. She tried to make it sound reasonable, like I was just too emotional to see things clearly, like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. She kept going. She said she hadn't needed that trip, that it was important for her and Greg to start their marriage off right, that she had assumed I would be okay because I was so independent. She told me I had no idea how hard it was for her to leave that night. She wanted me to feel sorry for her, like she was the victim here. Emma didn't let her finish. She cut in, voice sharp and cold, telling my mom to get to the point, to stop justifying herself and actually say why she was here. My mom faltered. Then she said it. She wanted me to come home. She acted like it was obvious, like it was the natural conclusion to all of this. She had come back, so now things could go back to the way they were. I didn't though. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and finally saw it for what it was. She wasn't upset because she had hurt me. She was upset because I had left. Because for the first time, I had done something she couldn't control. She wasn't here to apologize. She was here to put things back in their place. I told her no. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't try to make her understand. I just said no. My mom's face crumpled, like she genuinely hadn't considered the possibility that I wouldn't go back with her. Like she had expected me to just let it go. She asked me why. I told her the truth. She had made her choice the night she walked out of that hospital. Now I was making mine. For the first time, my mom didn't have anything to say. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Then she turned to Emma, like maybe she could talk some sense into me. But Emma didn't say a word. She just stared back, unflinching, unmoved. Greg hadn't even come with her. That was the final confirmation, really. She had come here alone, expecting to fix things, expecting to guilt me into coming back. Greg hadn't even cared enough to pretend. My mom looked at me one last time. Then she turned and walked away. And I let her go. When the door shut behind her, it didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like anything at all. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where my mom had just been, waiting for some kind of overwhelming emotion to hit me. Anger, sadness, relief, something. But there was nothing, just a dull, empty silence. Emma stayed by the door, arms still crossed, watching me carefully like she expected me to break down at any second. I didn't. I just turned away, walked back into the apartment, and sat down at the kitchen table like nothing had happened. The next few weeks were strange. Not bad, just strange. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells. I wasn't being ignored at the dinner table, wasn't spending holidays as an afterthought, wasn't waiting for some inevitable moment of disappointment. There was no Greg sighing whenever I spoke, no forced small talk with my mom as she brushed me aside for him. It was just me and Emma, and it was normal. We developed an unspoken routine almost immediately. She worked during the day, and I took it easy while I recovered. I slept in, watched mindless TV, slowly built my strength back up. Emma left food in the fridge for me, texted me random things throughout the day like she had always been part of my life, like we had never lost those years in between. It felt easy in a way I hadn't expected. She never made me feel like I owed her anything. Never made me feel like she was doing me a favor by letting me stay. She just acted like my sister, like she had always been my sister, and I had always been welcome. That should have been normal. But after years of feeling like an outsider in my own family, it was something I had to get used to. My mom didn't stop trying to reach me. At first, the messages were angry. She accused me of being dramatic, of making a scene, of being ungrateful after everything she had done for me. She sent paragraphs about how I didn't understand how hard things had been for her, how I had embarrassed her, by running away like some rebellious teenager. I didn't respond. Then the guilt tripping started. She told me she missed me, that she loved me, that Greg wasn't that bad, and that I needed to stop being so stubborn. She said she forgave me for how I had acted and that I should come home so we could work things out. I still didn't respond. Then came the apologies, or at least what she thought were apologies. They weren't really apologies at all, just half-hearted acknowledgments that she could have handled things better, followed by more excuses. More attempts to make me feel guilty for not giving her another chance. I ignored those too. She must have gotten tired of talking to herself, because eventually the messages slowed down. Then they stopped completely, and I felt lighter for it. By the time a full year had passed, I was a completely different person. I had a job, I was saving up for my own place, and most importantly, I was finally free from the constant weight of trying to be enough for someone who had never valued me to begin with. Emma and I had built something real, something solid. She hadn't just saved me from my mom and Greg. She had given me back my life. We celebrated my 18th birthday together. Nothing huge, just a quiet dinner at home, a cake she baked herself. She made a joke about how her mom probably didn't even realize what day it was, and I laughed. Actually laughed because for the first time I didn't care. I didn't feel bitter about it. That part of my life was over. I still think about my mom sometimes. Not in a way that makes me sad, not in a way that makes me wonder what if. Just in the way that people sometimes think about things they used to know. Like an old house they don't live in anymore. Like a book they never finished reading. She's a part of my past, but she will never be a part of my future. And for the first time in my life, I'm okay with that.